Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm so glad to see you all at this very early hour of the coldest morning and this winter. It's supposed to be minus 17 centigrade. It's quite cold. This winter has been very severely cold. We had cold weather throughout this winter. But we are not too concerned about this cold weather because we do know that spring will come soon and warm weather will be back. On the other hand, the global economy is going through a winterly severe slump, but we are not sure yet whether we are near the end of the severe winterly slump. In that regard, this morning we have a special guest speaker who can enlighten us on global economy by concentrating on Eurozone crisis and its current situation and future outlook. He's from German Central Bank, which is Deutsche Bundesbank. I'm not going to introduce him in detail. I would rather leave it to our German ambassador, who is with us here this morning. But he will introduce our speaker soon. With this, I don't think I will spend much time since many of you would be various questions and comments after his presentation. Since we have many distinguished guests and including so many ambassadors, I'm sorry not be able to recognize you all individually. Well, with this, I would like to invite our German ambassador, Rolf, the Mafia. You know, I always have to look at this and just, mistakenly you call Raphael rather than Mafia. Rolf Mafia, the ambassador from Germany, has been with us since last year. Since he has been with us, with this group, a few times before, so he is not entirely new. But I just want to remind you of a few things about him. He has had a very distinguished foreign service for his government, of course, Federal Republic of Germany. And he served in various capacities before he came to Seoul. He served in Brussels. He served in Geneva on behalf of his government and dealing with NATO and disarmament. And also he served in his embassy in Tokyo. And he was Director General for Political Affairs. I'm sure he knows a lot about Japanese politics. And he also served in the government's embassy in Tehran and Iran. Okay, with this, let me invite Ambassador Mafia. Please.
안녕하십니까? 마파엘 독일대사 이에요. 반갑습니다. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, dear Sagong-il, dear Deputy Governor of the Bank of Korea, Kang, dear colleagues, excellencies, let me start off by expressing our deep appreciation for the excellent cooperation with IGE and Sagong-il and thanking you and IGE for organizing this meeting together with us and co-hosting this meeting. This year, we are celebrating 130 years of Korean-German relations, and at the same time also the anniversary of the agreement between Germany and Korea from 1963 about sending miners and nurses to Germany, which was very important for Germany and Korea in our economic development. Therefore, we want, of course, to highlight the presence of Germany here in Korea. This will go through cultural events, but the main subjects to be taken up will be cooperation in science and technology, cooperation between universities, and German language. But if we look at politics and economics, it was clear to us that the outstanding issue which we should present here in Korea, a German and European perspective, is the crisis of the Eurozone, the changes in economic governance of the Eurozone, the changes in the banking sector. And therefore, we were very happy that we can start our program actually this year precisely on this issue. And therefore, I'm particularly pleased to welcome at this juncture Dr. Andreas Dombret, distinguished member of the Executive Board of the Deutsche Bundesbank, with responsibilities for financial stability, risk controlling, and statistics. And if I may add, one could say the foreign minister of the Bundesbank. Dr. Dombret has a most impressive career as a banker, and he has been for a long time the first professional banker changing to the executive board of the Bundesbank. He was born as a son of German parents in the United States, went to school in Germany, and studied business management in Münster and Erlangen. He started a most impressive banking career with Deutsche Bank, and then subsequently holding executive positions in JP Morgan, as co-head of Rothschild Germany, and many years as vice chairman Europe of the Bank of America. So he certainly is perhaps the most knowledgeable speaker that we can have to see all these things from both a regulator, government, Bundesbank, and a banker's perspective, which should be particularly interesting. So I'm very happy to have you here, Mr. Dombret, and I may hand you the floor. Thank you.
Dear Chairman, Dr. Sakong, dear Ambassador, dear colleague, Deputy Governor, Kang, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, very happy to be here today in Korea. Thank you very much for inviting me. I've been in your country several times in 2010 under the Korean presidency of the G20, when we were here rather often and had very, very good meetings. But we felt at the Bundesbank it was about time to come for a bilateral meeting rather than for a multilateral meeting. And I have to say that the last 2 days have been fascinating. I learned a lot. And today I'd like to bring you our thoughts about the European debt crisis. And I have to say, looking around in this room, as far as Korea is away from Germany and Germany is away from Korea, I have to say I'm quite impressed by the level of interest in European topics, and especially, of course, in the European sovereign debt crisis. What I would like to do is I'd like to give you our point of view of how we see the European sovereign debt crisis and what kind of possible solutions we see going forward. The beginning of this year, 2013, is marking now the start of the 6th year of the international financial crisis. So we are in year number 6, and it's the 4th year of the European sovereign debt crisis. And actually, at the beginning of this year in 2013, we are in a similar situation than we were before. There are a number of areas where I think we need to move forward, both globally as well as in Europe. If I may, I'd like to start at the international level. I believe that we made quite significant progress, for instance, in the international regulatory banking reform. If you think, for example, of Basel III, these new capital requirements should now be transposed into national law worldwide. By the way, this of course includes the United States of America. And I'm confident that we will make some reasonable progress soon. It is, I think, in all of our common interest to implement higher capital standards and higher liquidity standards and requirements in a globally consistent manner, and of course as soon as possible. Global current account imbalances have also shrunk noticeably since the peak in 2007. There have been adjustments in all major deficit and non-oil exporting surplus countries, which contributed to these developments, and I'm confident that this progress does not merely reflect cyclical factors. After having made these comments on the international level, I'd like to add now on the European level that we have also reached a number of milestones, but that we are still heading for the final destination in Europe. European financial markets are currently picking up again. Take a look at the exchange rate of the euro, for example, look at the equity markets, look at the European bond markets. Countries as well as banks in Europe have been able to obtain funding easily in recent weeks, partly at sharply lower interest rates. This includes financial institutions in Portugal and Ireland, even if these issuances were still not very large, but they were able and possible for the first time since quite some time. And initial progress is also being made in crisis countries due to their structural reforms. However, the situation, of course, remains vulnerable. The political willingness to reform must not be allowed to slow down. Otherwise, there may be setbacks, and, if I may add, quite dangerous setbacks. Now, to draw conclusions on where Europe should be going in the long run, I think we first need to look more closely at the root causes of the crisis, and we need to agree what the root causes of the crisis are before really being able to make a decision of how to go forward. Now, the causes of the sovereign debt crisis are rather easy. Many people try to explain them in a very complicated manner, but the causes of the crisis in Europe are unhealthy economic developments. By the way, these unhealthy economic developments also happened in many other countries, and they're basically threefold. We had excessive lending, we did have asset price bubbles, and we had a loss of competitiveness. And all these three causes of the crisis are structural problems, and these structural problems were the breeding grounds for the problems Europe is facing today. If you look at the European Monetary Union, which is a quite unique concept, the actual weak link at the launch of the European Monetary Union was a combination of a single monetary policy, centralized at the European Central Bank, and at the same time of a decentralized fiscal policy. I guess you all will know that while we did centralize monetary policy in the Eurozone, the national level, the countries, are still responsible for their fiscal policies. Now, the founding fathers of our European Monetary Union saw this right from the beginning, and they created a framework of rules to prevent, or let me say at least to correct, any unhealthy development. And this set of rules is called the Stability and Growth Pact. Now, this Stability and Growth Pact, intended to keep national fiscal policies at bay and sort of intended to bridge the central monetary policy and the decentralized national fiscal policy. Let me remind you what's in the Stability and Growth Pact. Now, first of all, one of its tenets was the deficit limit. Annual government budget deficit should not exceed 3% of GDP. In addition, a debt limit was introduced of 60% of GDP. Sometimes I feel this is sort of insufficiently attended to in comparison to the deficit limit. Of course, there's also a debt limit, and very much also at the time on the assistance of the Bundesbank, we also have a so-called no bailout principle, which means that member states within the Eurozone are forbidden from assuming liability for the debts of other member states. And this was done with quite a good reason. If I may add up these principles of the Stability and Growth Pact, one could summarize this as the guiding principle of individual responsibility. What do I mean by that? The idea of the monetary union is that member states are individually responsible for the consequences of their policies. They are individually responsible for the fiscal policy and all the effects coming from that. And investors are individually responsible for the consequences of their investment decisions. So, if we have a situation that sometimes markets are criticized for, increasing spreads, etc., I don't think that's fair, because the entire idea of the monetary union in Europe was that the markets would discipline if fiscal policy is not a fiscal policy and spreads would just rise, and if you have a very solid fiscal policy, spreads would be low. That was the entire intention. So not somebody in Brussels is setting interest rates, but the markets are setting interest rates, and you are responsible for what you do as long as you stay within these guidelines of the debt limit, the deficit limit, and as long as there is no bailout. Now, as you all know in this room, over time, these rules of the Stability and Growth Pact were stretched and sometimes even disregarded. Countries violating these rules of the Stability and Growth Pact were not automatically punished. Instead, sanctions were put to a vote amongst the now 17 members of the monetary union. And it's a little bit under the motto of, I won't punish you today if you don't punish me tomorrow, that we never ever had a single sanction. Although we had the breaches of the Stability and Growth Pact. It's a little bit like, I scratch your back, you scratch my back. Now, financial markets did not exert the desired disciplining effects on fiscal policy either, because, as I just told you, it was the idea that the market would reward or punish situations where there's a solid or not solid fiscal policy. Investors, including international investors, turned a blind eye on the misbehavior of some governments in fiscal policy far too long. Until 2007, 2008, a Greek government bond had a yield of 7 basis points over German Bund. And when push came to shove, assistance became necessary for some member states of the European Monetary Union in order to prevent still worse things from happening. And I think it was the right thing to give assistance, and assistance programs were set up. Firewalls were elected, both by the European Union, but also including help from your country by the IMF. Now, I may like to add that although granting this assistance is quite understandable and the right thing to do in the short run, it is rather dangerous in the long run if countries with a debt problem can count on being bailed out no matter what. Which means that there is no incentive to reform if you are going to be bailed out no matter what. And then one is risking a very dangerous spiral of ever increasing assistance and at the same time ever dwindling confidence. Because the more the assistance rises, the more the confidence can go down. And that's where we are right now in the Eurozone. We are in a confidence crisis. And the public and the markets have, to some extent, lost faith in the politicians and in the architecture of the European Monetary Union. So as a central banker, the question you have to ask yourself, the question I am asking myself is, how can this faith in the European Monetary Union be restored? Let me please begin by stating clearly what will not work. It will not be a solution simply creating larger and larger rescue packages and continually raising firewalls. Such a strategy of ever bigger firewalls and ever bigger rescue packages ultimately has its limits. And these limits are both political limits and financial limits. And, by the way, monetary policy cannot put out the fire either, and I'll talk about this as a central banker in a little while. I'd like to make this very, very clear, and if there is something I'd like you to remember when you go to work, it's the following. Money cannot buy confidence. What money can do is, money can buy time. Time for economies to get into a better shape, but it's important that such bought time is then actually be used wisely to eliminate the root causes of the crisis, which is actually the crux of the matter, and that's why I started out showing them, and I'll come back to that point later. Now, what, in the view of the Bundesbank, are policy tasks to be tackled in this year, 2013 and onwards? My comments on the lack of confidence and the unhealthy institutional developments lead us to a number of key steps, I think, which require action, at least in our point of view. And there are 3 points, and I'd like to lead you through these points where we think action is needed. First, we have to put budget consolidation on the top of the agenda. These are challenges, by the way, not just in the euro area, but I guess we were, including yourself, no doubt all relieved that the United States policymakers were able to thresh out a deal to prevent the U.S. economy from falling over the edge of the fiscal cliff. It's not necessarily only a European issue, but I'm here talking especially about the European Union and the Eurozone. Clearly, there is no smooth, there is no straightforward, and there is no quick way out of the debt crisis. Neither in the United States, and for sure also not in Europe. And of course, fiscal consolidation normally dampens economic activity. Austerity dampens economic activity. I would argue, though, that the present situation cannot be called normal, though. We are not in a normal situation in Europe. So, while normally it would be absolutely correct that austerity will decrease economic activity, we are not in a normal situation, because if there are doubts about the sustainability of government finances, if there is doubt that the government, that your government will repay your interest, that your government will repay the debt the government owes to you, if there is this doubt about the sustainability of government finances, this in itself is a considerable drag on growth. And this needs to be, through consolidation of public finances, needs to be eliminated first. Now, there's one thing about this critic about austerity would dampen economic growth, which is correct. And that is that fiscal consolidation on its own is, of course, not enough to solve the current problem. So the second requirement we would put up as being necessary would be that the affected countries must carry out structural reforms in order to achieve two things in order to become more competitive and also in order to promote economic growth. I think we all agree that reforms of this kind are, of course, very difficult and also rather painful. But I would also like to add that we have in the Eurozone already achieved some progress. Ireland, for example, has shown that reforms are actually possible and that reforms hold out the promise of success. Portugal has made substantial progress, I can tell you. Italy, and we have the Italian ambassador here, and Spain too have taken measures that we consider positive. And if I may, as a German, do that, finally, Germany has demonstrated that structural reforms ultimately pay off, despite the fact that they are, of course, difficult and painful. So the process of adjustment in putting public finances and economic structures in order again are not going to take just a couple of months or just a couple of years. Please don't forget that the losses of competitiveness in the countries in crisis, for example, was also built up over a decade, and we cannot really expect that the solution of the crisis will be much shorter. So far about my second point. My third point, last but by no means least, is that we need a stable and a viable architecture for the European Monetary Union. So the framework of the European Monetary Union must be changed in such a way that sound fiscal policy and that competitive structures are also truly guaranteed in the future, that you can rely on those sound fiscal policies. The euro area, in our view, basically has two options. Either the Eurozone returns to the founding principles of the European Monetary Union as they were described in the Maastricht Treaty, but would, of course, work on the weaknesses we have seen in the last 4 years. This would involve giving the Stability and Growth Pact, if you want, more bite, for example, through a greater automatism to penalize breaches of the deficits and debt limits, so breaches are penalized automatically rather than by a vote whether or not this was a breach or not. So this is option number one. Restore, so to say, Maastricht, work on the weaknesses and change the weaknesses into better structures. Or the Eurozone can venture the step towards a deeper European integration, which also includes fiscal policy, which means that we sort of overcome this mismatch of a centralized monetary policy and a decentralized fiscal policy by sort of centralizing the fiscal policy. These are the two options. Now, the second option ultimately would mean that the budget setting authority would then no longer rest with the national parliaments, but would be at the European level. If you look at the meetings of the heads of governments and states, though, so far, however, we have seen very little headway on this issue. A so-called Fiscal Compact was adopted, but this Fiscal Compact, for your information, does not provide for intervention in national fiscal policy, even if a country repeatedly breaks the rules of the Stability and Growth Pact. So an intervention is not foreseen. This means that the Fiscal Compact, which was decided on, is not the same as a true fiscal or political union. Many countries in the Eurozone seem to be unwilling to give up their sovereignty, but giving up sovereignty would be indispensable for a true fiscal union. Let me say that the Bundesbank is neutral whether option one, i.e. a restoration of Maastricht, or B, a centralization of fiscal policy to the European level is taken. It's not for us to decide. This is up to parliaments and governments to decide, democratically elected representatives of their country. Both are economically viable solutions, but we have to go into either of the two in a very forceful and clear manner in order to lead our countries. So these are the three things which need to be done from our point of view. Let me repeat. A, we need consolidated budgets. We need structural reforms. And we need a stable architecture for the European Monetary Union. If I may, before I then, if you're interested, offer myself for a discussion, I'd like to touch on the current situation in the Eurozone. Because several important decisions have been taken last year. Firstly, the Governing Council of the European Central Bank decided to buy government bonds from crisis countries. This buying of government bonds will be subject to conditionality, but in principle will be in unlimited amounts. The second decision is that the European Commission proposed a concept of a banking union, which is, by the way, an important step towards a greater European integration. And the third quite important decision was an agreement about further assistance in a number of countries, especially in Greece, which were reached or, in the case of Cyprus, are on the way. If I may, I'd just like to offer a few words on each of these three more recent developments. First, with regard to the government bond buying program, I'd like to start by pointing out that I feel that the Euro system, which is the European Central Bank and the 17 national central banks, of which the Bundesbank is the largest, is making a very important contribution to safeguarding the stability of the financial system in the Eurozone. The Euro system has done many things over the past years. There have been several decreases in interest rates. There have been government bond purchases through a so-called securities markets purchase program. There have been two 3-year so-called LTROs in the amount of more than 1,000 billion euros. There have been covered bond purchase programs. The standards for collateral you need in order to refinance yourself with the same have been lowered, and I can go on and on and on. It's not as if the Euro system would not have made a major contribution to making sure that there is a financial stability in the Euro area, which is done in order to prevent a credit crunch from happening, which is done to support the real economy. Now, all these measures the central banks have taken ease the tensions in the money markets in order, as I said, to prevent a collapse in lending. Solvent banks in the Euro area can get liquidity in return for sufficient collateral. And I may remind you that the European Central Bank is in full allotment mode. However, I'd also like to comment that a too generous provision of liquidity can lead banks to take greater risks, which then could pose risks to financial stability. Also, the Euro system, i.e. the European Central Bank and all the other national central banks, including ourselves, are exposed to higher balance sheet risks, which means that there is a certain redistribution of burdens between national taxpayers through the balance sheets of the central banks. Now, the Bundesbank's concerns about this government bond purchases are well known, and I'll be very brief, and I don't want to be too repetitive. Firstly, as a matter of principle, we fear that the boundary between monetary policy and fiscal policy can well be blurred. It's very important that one can differentiate between fiscal policy and monetary policy. And if that should happen, then it would become more difficult to safeguard price stability. So it's important to keep fiscal policy and monetary policy apart. Secondly, by artificially reducing financing costs for governments, this can well reduce the incentives for necessary reforms as a matter of principle. And the most important point, if I may say, is that we strongly feel that the role of the Euro system is definitely not, it is not to redistribute or to neutralize solvency risks within the Euro area. This is exclusively reserved for democratically elected governments and parliaments. It's not a mandate of a central bank to redistribute or mutualize debt across borders. So far about the so-called OMT, Outright Market Transaction Program. Let me make some comments, please, about the banking union suggestion, which has been suggested by the European Commission. Currently, the discussion centers on two components. Firstly, on a common banking supervision, and there is a gentleman from the Korean financial services supervision here, for which I'm thankful. So firstly, we talk about a common banking supervision, and secondly, we talk about a common restructuring and resolution mechanism for banks in Europe. Now, all of this clearly can help to dissolve the interconnectedness between the banking system and the public finances, which is really quite important to do. A common supervision, we believe, offer advantages. Of course, they need proper structuring. If you increase transparency in national banking systems, you also make window dressing of balance sheet risks less likely, which is a good thing. It makes national banking systems less likely to become, if you wish, swept up in fiscal problems of their respective governments. And it ensures that the same high standards are applied everywhere across Europe. And it facilitates dealing with cross-border systemic effects. All very positive signs. At the same time, I think it goes without saying, but let me say it anyhow, that a common supervision cannot, of course, prevent every case of distress in the banking system. But it can help, have the same standards. Also, what we need is, we need a common restructuring and resolution mechanism for banks in order to facilitate an orderly resolution of distressed banks. From a Bundesbank point of view, we think that first, owners and creditors of distressed banks must be made liable, and also a dedicated fund to which all these supervised banks have to make payments will additionally ease the burden on taxpayers before the taxpayers then, if at all, should be asked to contribute. Now, getting the design of the banking union right is a precondition for success. We think such a banking union should be introduced quickly, but of course not over hastily. One should not forget that establishing a banking union is a future-oriented concept, and such a future-oriented concept cannot be used to disguise transfers for covering existing balance sheet risks. The less such a banking union is burdened with legacies of the past, the better it can fulfill its task of an additional anchor of stability in the Eurozone. Last but not least, a couple of comments about the current situation in European peripheral countries. There has been an agreement about further assistance in a number of countries, of course, mainly Greece at the end of last year. However, if single countries like Greece do not implement the agreed reforms and do not manage to put its budget on a solid footing, the effect of such new assistance programs, of such new aid programs and measures will evaporate. Announcing and passing laws is important, but it's not enough if the administration and the general public don't follow through with that and undermine it. So every country must do everything in its power to strengthen its competitiveness and will have also our support. Our strongest belief in this respect is that the key to resolving the sovereign debt crisis lies with the governments of the affected countries. It does not lie necessarily with other euro area countries, and in particular, it does not lie with monetary policy, because going to the printing press has so many risks I don't even want to list. Despite all the problems I just described, I think we must not forget that the European monetary union per se, in itself, is not being called into question. We stand fully behind the European monetary union and the currency. Yet, a need for greater integration has become apparent, and a need to reform the institutional framework of the monetary union has become very clear. So when the Bundesbank emphasizes risks and side effects of measures, we are not aiming to impede the stabilization of the euro. We are aiming to the contrary. Our objective is to safeguard the stability of the euro and nothing else. So let me please summarize. I have touched on various political aspects, which I believe to be essential for overcoming the crisis. I also strongly believe that the rebalancing of the euro area is well underway. Now, it is very important, it is crucial that we uphold this momentum, this positive momentum, by pursuing comprehensive structural reforms. The European Monetary Union cannot afford any reform fatigue, which would be actually very dangerous. And one thing is very certain: finding a sustainable long-term solution to the sovereign debt crisis is the key factor for future economic developments, very much so in Europe, but also worldwide. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm very happy, should there be any questions, to take those questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Dombret, for a very comprehensive survey of the Eurozone crisis, current situation, and what needs to be done. But the question is, all those things will be done. What is the outlook? And I'm sure there are many questions and comments from the floor. So why don't I collect 2 or 3 questions or comments first, and then we'll have another round of getting comments and questions. Okay, Minister Kwon.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Dombret. Thank you very much for your insightful lecture. I used to be minister in the Prime Minister's Office, Korea, and ambassador to the OECD. So I have a lot of the experience and knowledge of the issues you just raised. But I have one concern. Your conclusion is correct that the budget consolidation or health fiscal situation to reduce debt and deficit. And another thing is structural reform. But I wonder whether structural reform can be done, or even if after structural reform, is there any guarantee that some country can get the comparative advantage or competitiveness? Because Korea is following the some part of Nordic welfare model. Every year our gross rate of welfare spending more than 9% compare the general budget spending. And then every time we have election, candidates raise more welfare program. To do it successfully, we should know the Nordic model. But I think there are one important, the preconditions. How much the society is transparent and there is no corruption. And how much there is an underground economy. And I think these things all come from philosophical approach. Which lifestyle you want to have? Like Germans work day and night. Somebody criticized no leisure. Not fun. You don't know fun. But some country people want more leisurely life. So that's one philosophical issue. And second is like Greece and some other country, the tax evasion is over, and they don't want to. They don't think that is a wrong thing to deceive government. And the transparency issue and the underground economy, it is not easy. So I wonder whether if after, budget consolidation is not an easy issue? And also, structural reform. Even if after structural reform, do you think Greece or some other country can get competitiveness? Thank you.
Yep.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
All right. Okay. Any other questions? Dr. An, yeah, Professor An, Professor Emeritus from Chungang Universities.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dombret. Given the stringent reform requirement toward fiscal and monetary union, as you eloquently described, at this point, European Union, including the European Central Bank, adopted the basically quantitative easing policy to resolve immediate, sovereign debt crisis. Well, as you know well, United States has also adopted the QE policy to resolve their own problem. Now, Japan also, follows the same, the quantitative easing policy to induce a depreciation of Japanese yen. So how do you see this quantitative easing policy according to the neighbor sort of bigger policy? And, Japanese depreciation of yen seriously impacted a Korean, export competitiveness. So what is your view on this, the advanced economy joining QE policy direction in the short run? Second question, you really described a long road for the fiscal and the monetary union, okay? Now, in due process, Prime Minister Cameroon, he indicated UK may, leave the European Union. So I understand that the national referendum will take place, by 2017? So what is your view if United Kingdom leave the EU or if United Kingdom stay in European Union? So what is the EU's, policy direction, whether the United Kingdom stay in as member or out of the European Union? Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, one more, please. Yes, the Deputy Governor, Bank of Korea.
I personally, I have read of your speech and many times, Financial Times frequently. And I like your mentioning about money cannot buy confidence, money just can buy time to revive the economy. But as you can clearly put it, your speech.
Close to speak. Yeah.
It seems to me that these days, many fiscal policy and monetary policy, there's no demarcation of that these days. So many times, central bank are required to put in place their power to their fiscal domain area these days. Good case in good point is Japan. Like, say they have only 0.5 potential GDP growth rate, but targeting 2% inflation rate, which is not sustainable, to my mind. So I'd like to know your view furthermore about. I'd like to listen to your view further about the relationship between fiscal policy and also as well as monetary policy.
Okay. Now I think we have enough for first round.
First of all, thank you for the questions. I should say that while my little speech was not under Chatham House rules, this is the discussion I was asked to put under Chatham House rules, which makes it much better for you because I can be a little bit more open. But for the ladies and gentlemen from the press, this is now should not be filmed and should not be discussed and attributed to this meeting. First of all, I'm very honored, Minister, by your question, and honored by your presence here. And you touched upon the most important issue I think we have, which is how can we increase competitiveness. I realize that not every country in the world can have a trade surplus, for example, like Germany, but every country can become more competitive. And the idea of a union which is a monetary union but not a political or fiscal union, something has to hold the union together, a certain understanding of each other. And as in any union, including a family, it is important that there have to be some rules, not in order to involve them, not in order to make other members of the family or the union having less fun, but in order to make sure that this mismatch of a centralized monetary policy and a not at all centralized fiscal policy is not going to break apart the union. Now, any other idea which is better than rules, I'm happy to talk about, but there has to be a common understanding, and there has to be also an incentive to stay within the set of rules and the set of agreements one has entered into. And if you, as a country, or as an economy rather, get into a situation that you leave this agreement, there is just a necessity, if you want to be part of the monetary union, and we want every member of the monetary union to stay part of the monetary union, there's a necessity also, not only with regard to your own people, but also with regard to the people of the other countries, i.e. out of European solidarity, to follow through with structural reforms in order to make sure that this union stays together and is together successful. So what I'm trying to say is not everybody can be as successful at the same time, all the time, but of course there has to be an understanding that if one is less successful, one has to make a special effort in order to become more competitive. Now, Germany started its structural reforms, and I can tell you they were rather painful and difficult, under the title of Agenda 2010, under Chancellor Schröder. And despite the fact having very rigid labor markets, Germany flexibilized labor markets. There was a lot of anxiety and not much fun, I have to say, about these structural reforms. But as you can see, now one would argue that they are paying off. Of course, Germany did those structural reforms in a time of upswing, economic upswing, which in retrospect looks very smart, but and of course it's much more difficult and even more painful to do that in times of a downswing, or I can see that, but it is very hard to say what's the chicken and the egg here. What do you have to do first, a structural reform, or shall you work on growth? And as I tried to point out, there is no way that around structural reforms in the countries which are in the crisis. And I may say that there is no disagreement whatsoever about this in the European Central Bank's Governing Council at all. That is a fully accepted concept. Professor, you asked about quantitative easing, first of all. And my colleague, the Deputy Governor from the Bank of Korea, asked a little bit about the same. And if I may, I can combine those two questions, because Deputy Governor Kang asked about the fine line between fiscal policy and monetary policy, which has to do with quantitative easing. Now, I would first of all argue that the European Central Bank is not doing quantitative easing. The European Central Bank has a program in place which has not been used to buy, under a strict conditionality, government bonds, but not in terms of quantitative easing, but in order to make sure that the funding spreads are being affordable. I'm trying to say this a little vague, but not in order to manipulate the euro to in any way, by no means, the euro system has in mind to change the value of the euro vis-à-vis other currencies. That is not the intention of this program whatsoever. By the way, within the G7 and within the G20, as the chairman knows so well, we have existing agreements in place that we shouldn't do that in the first place. And whenever a country, I'm not going to mention any country, whenever a country of the G20 or the G7 were to do that, we would remind them that any intervention in the currency is something which we have excluded as a possibility amongst ourselves in a multilateral agreement. Now, quantitative easing, of course, is having effects on certain economies, and especially if very large countries do quantitative easing, very large economies do quantitative easing. So the Bundesbank has shifted its position on capital controls somewhat. We used to be of the strong and strict typical German opinion that capital controls are of no good and one should not do capital controls whatsoever. But I realize that in an environment of very low interest rates at the lower zero bound, and quite strong quantitative easing measures in some very large economies, that under certain circumstances, capital controls may be justifiable, but only under certain circumstances, only for a certain very limited period of time and in a very transparent manner. So we have gone from an absolute no to capital controls to a more, if I may say, mixed, a little bit more balanced view. Still, we would think that capital controls are not the way to try to influence the currency, but that the increase of competitiveness, to come back to your question, Minister, that the increase of competitiveness, fundamental economic terms, should be reflected in a currency and nothing else. So that is the belief we continue to hold, despite the fact that we sort of made a little shift on the way we look at capital controls. And then a professor asked the second question about the UK and Prime Minister Cameron's speech with regard of the membership of the United Kingdom in the European Union. I have to say, with all due respect, this is outside of monetary policy. So I rather don't feel fully, how should I say, fully equipped and established to answer that. And if I may try to stay within fiscal or monetary policy issues, where I have a little bit bigger advantage to answer the questions properly. But I understand the question, and it's an important question, but I'm not the right person to really be in a position to answer it. That doesn't mean that I'm a shy person, but I'm just not very, very good at answering that question.
For the reporters, let me reiterate again what Mr. Dombret asked me to put the Q&As on the Chatham House rule. What that means is that you're not allowed to attribute specifically to Mr. Dombret because he is still with Bundesbank, and I'm sure
I plan to stay with
so yeah, that is important, but he wants to stay there, so that's why you can see the sensitivity. So other countries involved, please be the careful about quoting him. You are fully allowed to quote whatever he said during the presentation. So I think you can do that, but please save his job. Help to save his job. You know, this quantitative easing and a lot of things going on, particularly Koreans are very sensitive about what's happening in Japan. And so that's why I really would like to emphasize the G20 should do something. And in that regard, I've been advocating very strongly the Korean government should take a lead there as well. Because there's no ownership in the G20 as of now. And unless G20 at the G20 level do something about this, for the sake of Japanese economy, for the sake of U.S. economy, maybe quantitative easing may have some grounds, but it has financial repercussions at the global community level. So unless something is done, then individual countries may have to resort to specific capital control measures, which are not helpful for those countries as well as for the whole world. That is the reason why the global community as a whole should do something, particularly G20, because G20 has the mandate to do that. And they agreed in Pittsburgh, including G20 leaders, including G7 leaders, to designate the G20 as a premier forum for international economic cooperation. So they shouldn't leave this on the G7, because G7 alone cannot handle this issue, because other major players not in the G7. So I really would like to see the G20 in Russia and Moscow do something about it, and before that, these finance ministers' meetings and the central bank governors' meeting do something about it.
Yeah, and let me just add, first of all, I'm going to Moscow next week, so if you think this is cold here,
please, yes.
This is cold here, I understand it's even colder in Moscow. And let's see whether this will be on the agenda or not. I'm not going to make a prediction.
I hope so, yeah.
But let me add to the question of my colleague from the Central Bank of Korea about the fiscal and monetary policy stance. We are quite concerned about any politicalization, if that's a good English word, politicalization of central banks. As the Bundesbank has always spoken out in favor of an independent central bank, this is not necessarily a comment to Japan or to Hungary or to any other situation, but it's a general comment that we strongly believe that central banks need to be independent and that fiscal policy needs to be, because it's also controlled by democratically elected officials, that fiscal policy needs to be separate from monetary policy, especially if monetary policy wants to keep in the goal of price stability, which is the overarching goal of every central bank. So this is a concern, and we would be worried. My president, Jens Weidmann, would be worried of the Bundesbank if we would have more politicalization of central banks. That would be, in the long run, in the medium to long term, not to the benefit of the overall economy.
Okay. Now, another round. Yes, please. Microphone, please. Yes.
I'm Johannes Regenbrecht from the German Embassy. Dr. Dombret, two questions. First, you mentioned the Fiscal Compact as a key element for the European Union or for the Euro 17 to enforce fiscal discipline. Maybe you could recall us the key instrument, the sanction instrument that makes this Fiscal Compact a new one, or gives it a new stability in as compared to the Maastricht Treaty. A second point, banking supervision, the new plans and projects of the Commission. There is some criticism in the German media as to the question as to whether it is appropriate to establish the new supervisory authority with the ECB, namely blurring the line between central bank on the one side and supervision authority on the other side. Might be you could comment on that as well. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions? Okay, then.
And then I'll quickly answer that. These two questions, actually. First of all, with regard to the Fiscal Compact, which was decided by the heads of governments and states last year, I continue to think that this was a good decision, a fruitful decision, which will bring us more towards option one of the two options I laid out, more towards a repair of the Maastricht Treaty. It's a step into the right direction, but we have at the same time to say, as much as it helps to foster fiscal discipline, it is not a fiscal union. It is not a Europeanization of fiscal policies. It's not member states giving up sovereignty in terms of fiscal policy. That's all what I tried to say. With regard to your question of banking supervision, which, if I may recall, which I support, or which the Bundesbank in principle supports, the decision has been taken to host this bank supervision within the European Central Bank. That's not the model of the Deutsche Bundesbank, where we, as you know, my colleague over there knows, where we have, a separate regulator in Germany, the BaFin, which does the regulation. I think you have the same model in Korea, where the central bank and financial supervision is different. But many countries have it in an integrated way. So where the central bank at the same time also executes the bank supervision. So it is possible, of course, there needs to be a Chinese wall, a high Chinese wall between bank supervision on the one hand and monetary policy on the other. I'm not a lawyer. The question would be, who takes now final decisions in an environment of a European Central Bank if there is a major decision to be taken in bank supervision? Will this have to go to the Governing Council of the European Central Bank or not? Will there be, I'm trying to say it sloppy, will there be a situation where the members of the Governing Council before the coffee break decide about monetary policy and after the coffee break decide upon bank supervision? Or will there, most of the decisions, maybe all of the decisions being able to be taken within the bank supervision part of the ECB? That has to be worked on, but I'm confident that that one can work this out. So whatever sometimes is voiced in the German media is, I think, far too premature. We should go about this in a positive and in a constructive manner, not in a manner that it needs to be ready tomorrow. This is a very, 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 very large project in the middle of a financial crisis, so it has to be done in a proper and orderly manner, but I would like to go about this in the most constructive way possible.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, the former president of Johong Bank, which was one of the largest banks in Korea, but which is now merged into other bank. But Mr. Chair, please.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dombret. I have some specific questions on Greece. That as the Dr. Sagong mentioned, that I'm a lifetime banker. And I have a question from banker's perspective, that banker is looking at the country as a borrower. And then I have to think about, I tend to think that if the country will restore the competitiveness of its economy, and can they generate the future cash flow to pay back debts, they got the waiver of debt repayments already. But looks like, I suspect that they have to borrow more and more in future again and again. And then to survive, to keep their people stay alive, they may have to get another waivers of debt repayments. With that kind of scenarios, can they stay and remain as member of EU? Thank you.
Thank you, President, for that question. I don't want and will not speculate about scenarios, but I'm happy to say a couple of words about Greece. Now, as in any reform program, the key lies in the implementation of the reform program. And the models I've seen and the agreement I have seen makes me confident that Greece can return to a primary surplus maybe next year, to a primary surplus, rather soon, which is, as you as a banker know, a primary surplus is already something which is quite achievable. For example, we have the Italian ambassador here, and Italy has a primary surplus. Sometimes that's important to be said, although everybody should know it in the first place, but it's there, and Greece is doing a lot of efforts, I have to say, formidable efforts, in order to get back to a primary surplus. Now, should the reform program be implemented? It's quite a long-standing reform program. Yeah, Greece has a absolute realistic chance of getting back to a debt to GDP level of between 120 and 130 at the end of this decade. There's no guarantee that a debt to GDP of 120 to 130 level, is manageable. But we have experience in the Eurozone with Belgium, which had this debt level. Italy has the debt level, and they're all producing primary surpluses. So at least there is some evidence that it can work rather well, when actually Belgium worked out of that high debt level and is now rather below that debt level. So I think there's a realistic chance. Clearly, Greece lived above its means for some time, which one could not see, also because of the fact that the data displayed and the statistics displayed were just not correct. So there was an illusion about what Greece could afford, which is, of course, very unfortunate. Looking back doesn't help here. So to answer your question, without speculating on scenarios, I think there is a realistic scenario in the long run that Greece can return to debt levels which are manageable and which make them competitive, and where the cash flow, as you put it, is enough to service the debt.
Okay. Yeah.
Welcome, Dr. Dombret. I am from the monthly magazine Diplomacy. I have a very simple question. Will you comment on Korean economy?
I can make it a long comment or a short comment. The short comment would rather not. The long comment is, especially as you represent a newspaper which is called Diplomacy, I can only tell you that within the G20 framework, Korea is a very respected partner. And this is due to many aspects, but mainly to the aspect that there's a lot of respect of what your country economically has achieved over the past years, and that also the members of the G20, including the gentleman to my left, have over many years displayed a high level of professionalism, which was especially clear to be seen in the 2010 presidency of Korea of the G20. So you are a very, very respected partner. The same, of course, holds true for the Bank of Korea. In all committees where I am with Korean representatives, I can only report about a very, very good and close relationship, not only with Germany, but with the European Union and all the other members.
Okay, with this we have to end this very interesting and productive morning session. I'm very sure that particularly the press reporters here would be very much interested in specific the country prospects and outlook, including Greece, which you answered well. But and also I do know that Mr. Dombret has many strong personal views on many issues, but because of his current position to save his job, we have to refrain ourselves from asking awkward questions, and so we have to stop here. And also on his presentation, I'm sure there can be some disagreement I don't think we need to bring Paul Krugman or Larry Summers talk about the Keynesianism versus the Hayekism or whatever. Austerity, in my view, again, austerity is critical and structural adjustments are important, but I think it can be combined to some way as a quid pro quo, just like what Korea did during the Korean currency crisis. We did have austerity, but we did have some stimulus packages as well, and it was done in a way of quid pro quo and conditionality. So you do both, and somehow, if EU at the EU level have a strong political will to do so, then force others to implement structural adjustment. Otherwise, they don't get the bailout fund. So this again, because 17 countries involved, and it's a difficult thing to do. But I think there's a way to do it, and you just cannot force austerity alone, as you said. And the 50% of all the youth unemployment, and how can you deal with the social problem? And so I think it's something needed to. But in any case, I think he has many points to discuss, but we have to end here. But I would like to underline one of the points he made, and that is that German structural adjustments are paying off. Agenda 2010 is very, very critical. Some usually make a casual comments like, Germans benefited so much from the introduction of euro. Yes, Germans did benefit. Thanks to, but Agenda 2010 and the structural adjustment. So I think this part needs to be emphasized, and this is very, very relevant to Korea as well. And so this point is really important to underline and to re-emphasize. Well, with this, we should end, and some press requested some specific interviews there. I'm sure he will express some of the points, his points carefully. Well, please join me in thanking Mr. Dombret.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much.